Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 90 called 300 Heroes. In early 544, Belisarius was on the boat back to Italy. His job was to rescue the rapidly deteriorating situation there. And it was truly dire. Procopius tells us that the Roman army was not only retreating from the Goths, but it had lost its discipline and was now more of a menace to the Italian population than the Goths themselves. Quote, "The commanders of the Roman army, together with the soldiers, were plundering the possessions of their subjects, and they didn't shrink from any act of insolence and licentiousness whatsoever. The officers were cavorting with mistresses inside the fortresses, while the soldiers, showing themselves more and more insubordinate to their commanders, were falling into every form of lawlessness." End quote. Meanwhile, Procopius, who was now no longer Belisarius's legal secretary and was writing the last section of his long history of the wars from the safety of Constantinople, instead of being within earshot of the Goths battering at the gates, seems to sympathise more with the Goths than the Romans. This is an interesting step in his own personal development, discernible in his writings from being an admirer of Justinian to his fiercest critic. For example, in contrast to the disorderly conduct of the Roman soldiers, he describes the Gothic king meting out punishment to a Gothic soldier accused of raping a young Italian maiden. Quote, "He executed the man and gave to the raped girl all the money that belonged to him." End quote. It was now up to Belisarius to restore the situation. But the legendary soldier had one major problem. He had almost no soldiers. This was because there were none to spare. After the sack of Antioch in 540, the bulk of the Roman army was concentrated in the east to prevent another Persian incursion, while the Roman forces in Italy were completely insufficient to defeat the Goths. In Justinian's defence, it must be said the empire's overall position was made far worse by the plague that ravaged it in 541-543. As discussed in the last episode, tax revenues had probably at least halved, as shown by the temporary devaluation of the gold solidus, as we've already discussed. The onset of the plague had made the military situation in the west extremely precarious. Indeed, it's astonishing Belisarius agreed to go to Italy at all. Presumably, Justinian promised him soldiers would be forthcoming, but almost none were. Even his bucellarii were retained on the eastern front. Financing was tight, to say the least. In the wars, Procopius says Justinian gave him some money, but in his more honest, secret history, he tells us Belisarius promised the emperor, quote, he would never ask him for money during the campaign, but would himself pay for all the necessary equipment out of his own pocket, end quote. It was an extraordinarily generous offer from Belisarius, even if he was reputed to have enormous wealth. The only explanation can be his wish to restore good relations with Justinian after falling out with the emperor in 543 over the allegations made in the secret history that he would prefer a different type of emperor if Justinian died of the plague. But not even Belisarius's wealth could finance an entire field army, and that was what was needed in Italy. In light of this, it's hard to see what Justinian expected Belisarius to achieve. He began by recruiting 4,000 troops in Thrace and led this small force to Salona on the Adriatic coast to cross to Ravenna, which was still in Roman hands. When he got there, he found an almost impossible military situation. The Goths were in control of most of Italy, with the Romans only holding on to a handful of fortified towns, including the principal cities of Ravenna and Rome. He didn't have enough soldiers to risk a pitched battle with the Gothic king Totila, and the best thing he could do was to play a game of cat and mouse, trying to stem the Gothic reconquest by strengthening the garrisons of the places being besieged. Meanwhile, Totila was forcing the Roman strongholds to capitulate one by one. It was a slow process, and Belisarius stopped him from taking Bologna and Osimo. But he couldn't launch any sort of counterattack. In desperation, he dispatched Bloody John, the commander who'd been insubordinate in his first campaign, to Constantinople to beg Justinian for reinforcements. Procopius tells us that Belisarius complained even those troops holding out in Italy were not being paid. So desperate was the financial situation. Bloody John was an unexpected choice for Belisarius, since the two had been at loggerheads in the first Italian campaign. In addition, in the secret history, Procopius explains a subplot existed which Belisarius may have been unaware of. Bloody John was keen to further his career by marrying the daughter of Germanus, Justinian's cousin, who Theodora suspected of having designs on the throne. According to Procopius, she particularly disliked Bloody John's wish to marry into Germanus's family. Her objection was so vehement that John actually feared for his life, possibly at the hands of Antonina, who, as you know from the last episode, was Theodora's best friend and accomplice. This meant Bloody John achieved nothing in Constantinople to help Belisarius, although he advanced his own cause by marrying Germanus's daughter. Meanwhile, in Italy, Totila was winning the war. He took a series of Roman fortified towns in 544 and 545, including Spoleto, Assisi, Firmum, Asculum, Clusum and Oximum. By the end of 545, he was ready to attack Rome itself. Control of the Eternal City now took centre stage in this contest between Totila and Belisarius. The latter put 3,000 of his best troops into the city, determined to hold it at all costs. But landlocked Rome was always vulnerable to being starved into surrender, and although the Romans still held on to its port, Portus, which could get some provisions into the city from the sea, and although most of the civilian population had by now already left the city, soon the garrison's supplies ran dangerously low. Belisarius repeatedly tried to break through the Gothic defences to relieve the city, but to no avail. Finally, always the master of ingenuity, he came up with a daring plan. He put the entire cargo of grain from a large Sicilian fleet into 200 river transports. The idea was to sail these 15 miles up the river Tiber and into Rome. Opposing them were a series of obstacles. Gothic forces on the riverbank, a great iron chain laid across the river, and, most terrifying of all, a fortified bridge with Gothic bowmen ready to shoot at anything that moved underneath it. But Belisarius relished challenges like this. He put together a commando-style raid. First, he armoured his transport ships with wooden panels punctuated with holes to shoot through so that his men could pick off the Goths on the riverbanks. Then, to deal with the fortified bridge, he constructed a sort of fire ship by lashing transports together and placing them on a tower as tall as the bridge and loading it with flammable material to burn the bridge. Belisarius personally led the Roman attack force up the river. Everything went well. His archers cleared the riverbanks. His soldiers sorted out from the transport ships and dragged the great chain away. Then, most amazingly, his strategy with the fortified bridge worked. When his fire ship made contact with it, the Romans lit it and it exploded into flame, killing 200 Goths inside, including, Procopius tells us, a highly regarded Gothic commander, Osda. The Goths fell back, astonished by the ferocity of Belisarius's attack. But then disaster struck. Roman horsemen arrived saying Portus was under attack by the Goths and the Roman commander, Isaac, had been captured. This was true, but in fact Portus wasn't in danger of being occupied and its defenders had beaten off the Goths. However, according to Procopius, Belisarius panicked because his wife, Antonina, was in Portus. One senses Procopius felt he was overprotective, as always, towards his wife. Fearing for her safety, he called off the attack and the boats returned home. Defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. But worse than that, Procopius says Belisarius' distress was such that he had a fit of aphasia, meaning he temporarily lost the ability to talk, something that sometimes happens when someone has a stroke. He returned to Portus to find his wife was safe, but even so he fell ill with a fever which Procopius says nearly killed him. As Procopius frequently repeats, fate was against Belisarius in this second Italian campaign. And things went from bad to worse. On the 17th of December 546, almost exactly 10 years after Belisarius had captured Rome, the city fell to Totila. The Gothic king bribed a group of Isaurian soldiers to open the Asinarian gate. He let the Roman garrison exit by the opposite gate, in much the same way that Belisarius had first taken Rome without bloodshed. So Totila retook the city, with, according to Procopius, the deaths of only 26 soldiers and 60 civilians. But the Goths' reconquest of Rome was not the prelude to their recovery of Italy. It was not even a turning point in the war. Totila felt he didn't have enough troops to defend the city, so he considered burning it to the ground. According to Procopius, when Belisarius recovered from his illness, he sent a message to Totila, begging him to spare it, saying, quote, "Among all the cities under the sun, Rome is agreed to be the greatest and most noteworthy." End quote. Totila relented, but he demolished about a third of the walls and removed the city gates to make it indefensible if the Romans reoccupied it. And knowing his resources were limited, he was also desperate to make peace. With Rome back in Gothic hands, he thought he might have some leverage over Justinian. So he sent Pelagius, a papal deacon who'd appealed to him to show mercy to Rome's inhabitants, to Constantinople to ask for the restitution of the old peace between Goths and Romans, such as had existed in the days of Theodoric and Anastasius. According to Procopius, Justinian was not interested. He said Totila should negotiate with Belisarius, reiterating the same faith he had in his general as in the old days. Quote, he said he'd made Belisarius supreme commander in the war, and that he then had full power to make any settlement with Totila that he wished. End quote. But Justinian's support for Belisarius didn't extend to sending him reinforcements. So the increasingly ridiculous war of cat and mouse between the Romans and Goths continued for another 2 years. If Belisarius was short of troops, so too was Totila. He didn't have enough to defend Rome, which was in any case largely deserted by now with only a few hundred inhabitants. So in April 547, Belisarius, who by now fully recovered from his stroke, walked straight back into the city through its undefended gates. It must have seemed like a ghost town, but holding Rome at least carried some kudos, and Totila, criticised by his nobles for letting Rome be recaptured, was stung into action. He led his army south to retake the city, but Belisarius, in his most valiant encounter of his whole Second Italian campaign, used his horse archers to shoot down the Gothic cavalry. Procopius described the defeated Goths retreating to camp peppered with arrows stuck in their shields and embedded in their bodies. But Belisarius' heroism was to no avail other than holding on to Rome. His frequent requests to Justinian for reinforcements were met only in dribs and drabs, with nothing remotely sufficient to mount a proper campaign. In desperation, he sent Antonina to Constantinople to use her influence with Theodora, but when she arrived in early July 548, she found Justinian and the court in mourning. Theodora had died on June the 28th, 548, at around the age of 48. probably from cancer. This must have been an enormous blow to Justinian. Theodora had been the love of his life. He never remarried or took a mistress that we know of. Instead, his life became even more austere. He was increasingly withdrawn and devoted himself to religion, probably hoping to win back the divine favour that he seemed to have lost. Antonina had also lost her most powerful friend. There was nothing more she could do to help her husband. The days of the Fab Four were over. Meanwhile, back in Italy, things went from bad to worse for Belisarius. He left Rome to join reinforcements in Taranto in southern Italy, which had sailed down the Adriatic. They'd arrived from Armenia and included 2,000 horsemen under the command of Valerian. Taking 900 of his best men from Rome, including 700 horse archers, he set sail. But a storm blew his ships off course to land at Crotone, where they were ambushed by the Goths. His 700 horse archers were killed, almost to a man. This had a devastating effect on Belisarius. For once, his morale was broken. He wrote to Justinian asking to be relieved of his command. In the winter of 548 to 549, he was on the boat back to Constantinople. It was the end of his career as a general. Except for one last victory. The story of this was that in late 558, 10 years after he left Italy, a group of Huns called the Kutrigors, led by Zabigan, crossed the Danube and defeated the Thracian field army under the command of the Roman general Sergius. By March 559, they'd reached the long walls in Thrace, 20 miles from Constantinople itself. In panic, the aged Justinian turned to his old general to save the city. Our principal source is no longer Procopius, who probably died a few years earlier in around 555. Instead, a Greek lawyer, Agathias, provides us with a vivid description of Belisarius, who was around 60 years old, donning his armour and mustering an army to face the barbarians. He says he could only find 300 veterans to fight with him, although 300 might also be a poetic reference to the famous 300 Spartans who fought at Thermopylae. And so he recruited a large group of civilians to join him and gave them some basic military training. Repeating the tactics he used to defeat the Persians at the Battle of Dara nearly 30 years before, he got the citizens to dig a trench to attract a frontal assault by the Kutrigors, while he concealed his 300 veterans, all armoured horse archers, behind a hill. The Kutrigors fell into the trap. They sent an advance guard of 2,000 horsemen to probe this new Roman army. Seeing the infantry in their trench blocking their way, they charged them, only to be attacked in the flank by the concealed veterans. Agathias says 400 of the Kutrigors fell, but not a single Roman. To add to the Kutrigors' panic, Malalus, another chronicler, adds that Belisarius had ordered some citizens to cut down trees behind the trench and drag them around, blowing up a large cloud of dust to make it look as if a much larger Roman army was moving into position. This persuaded Zabigan to retreat all the way back to the Danube. Belisarius and his 300 were heroes. Agathias praises him just as Procopius might have done, quote, "By this feat of arms, which was to be the last in his life, Belisarius won as great a measure of glory as he'd done by his earlier victories over the Vandals and the Goths." End quote. This is our only mention of Belisarius after his recall from Italy, apart from two other brief incidents. One is an ecclesiastical record which mentions his involvement in negotiations in 552-3 to persuade Pope Vigilius to make concessions to the Monophysite Church. The other is 10 years later, in 562, when he was implicated in a plot against Justinian. This was an attempt to murder the emperor, orchestrated by a banker who held some grudge against him, which has never been made clear in our sources. Our only source, Malallus, tells us little other than that 7 months after being accused of treason and stripped of his titles, Belisarius was reinstated. He died 2 years later in March 565. Justinian, then around 83 years old, survived him by only 6 months, dying on the 14th of November 565. But this, albeit brief, punishment meted out to Belisarius seems to have been the basis for a popular legend that he, the ever-loyal general, was betrayed and blinded by a vindictive emperor. There's no contemporary evidence for the blinding whatsoever, but in the 10th century it became a popular story in medieval Byzantium, mentioned in a text called the Patria of Constantinople. Its popularity spawned several literary and artistic works in the early modern period, from a medieval Greek story called the Novel of Belisarius to an influential 18th century French novel called Belisarius, written by Jean-François Marmontel. The famous painter Jacques-Louis David depicted Belisarius in old age, blind and a beggar, in a picture entitled Belisarius Begging for Alms. The sculptor Jean-Baptiste Stouff made a striking bust of Belisarius, again blind and emaciated. More recently, in the 20th century, Robert Graves, author of the famous I Claudius books, wrote about Belisarius and Justinian in a historical novel called Count Belisarius, in which he portrays the general as a loyal soldier tragically mistreated by the scheming Justinian. However, Graves is clear Justinian never actually blinded him. Unfortunately, we'll never know the full truth about the relationship between Justinian and Belisarius, but I think it's safe to say it was close and complicated. Early in his reign, Belisarius enjoyed Justinian's complete confidence. His loyalty was unquestioned, his advice and actions valued more than those of any others except for Theodora herself. His quelling of the Nika riots saved Justinian. For that, he was rewarded with absolute authority over the army sent to reconquer North Africa. And of course, he delivered beyond all expectations. But his very success became a threat to Justinian's authority, and it would have been quite normal for any emperor to be suspicious of such a successful general. What about Belisarius? Did he harbour any ambition to be emperor? Procopius says not. Indeed, he explicitly says when he pretended to accept the position of Emperor of the West from the Goths, he had no intention whatsoever of rebelling against Justinian. In the secret history, he's almost frustrated with Belisarius's subservience to Justinian and to his wife Antonina. Was Belisarius too subservient to Justinian? Should he have tried to seize the throne? We can only guess at answers to these questions. My sense is that there was an opportunity for him to seize the throne in 542-3 when Justinian was ill with the plague. Belisarius was enormously popular at that time, so it's possible he could have staged a successful coup. Would it have been good for the empire? Again, it's impossible to say, but I suggest he would have done more to maintain the army than Justinian did, which I think was a major shortcoming in his reign, a subject to which we'll return in future episodes. So, to conclude, Belisarius was central to the age of Justinian. Indeed, it's impossible to imagine Justinian without Belisarius's victories. Belisarius delivered the clever battlefield tactics to realise Justinian's vaulting ambitions. Together, they achieved the impossible and made all things seem possible. The age of Justinian could just as well be called the Age of Belisarius. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time, on the 1st of June. And a special favour, please, if you like the podcast, could you recommend it to a friend? And of course, do also check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes to find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.